that you were able to go back and explore that relationship so many years later. Rosemary Terenzio, thanks so much for being with us. That does it for today. We'll be back with another edition of America Decides on Monday at 5 p.m. Eastern. The Daily Report with John Dickerson starts right now.
Welcome to the Daily Report for July 25th, 2024. I'm John Dickerson. The world still turns and Joe Biden is still president. So in the same office where he delivered his remarks Wednesday night on leaving the presidential race, the former candidate hosted the Israeli prime minister. We'll have the latest on U.S. pressure to get a ceasefire in Gaza. New economic numbers on growth in America suggest the economy is headed towards an outcome few expected. High growth, low unemployment, and manageable inflation. A golden state of affairs once thought impossible. We'll check in with the state of the economy. On the campaign trail, the new all but official Democratic nominee, Kamala Harris, traveled to a teachers' convention where they all gave her a gold star. Nancy Cordes reports, and Major Garrett will give us his take on things, too, including some of his interview with RFK Jr. We'll also talk to the author of a new Washington Post series on how presidents of both parties have used economic warfare across the globe. Plus, new immigration data, a loss in court for rideshare drivers, and a preview of the Olympics. The Daily Report starts in a moment. Hello, thank you for joining us. We begin our report with President Biden's Oval Office meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu 9.5 months into Israel's war with Hamas. The two sat where the night before. The president's family and close staff had watched him as he spoke to the country about his decision to drop out of the presidential race. Before the meeting, Netanyahu made a note of Biden's long history in government.
Mr. President, we've known each other for 40 years, and you've known every Israeli prime minister for 50 years, from Golda Meir. So from a proud Jewish Zionist to a proud Irish-American Zionist, I want to thank you for 50 years of public service and 50 years of support for the state of Israel.
The leaders later met with family members of hostages taken by Hamas on October 7th. Outside the White House gates, protesters held signs calling the president's guest a war criminal. Netanyahu had been greeted that way the day before, too, when he addressed members of Congress. In that address, Netanyahu referred to protesters as, quote, useful idiots for Iran, suggesting that knowingly or unknowingly they are serving Iran's interests by opposing Israel's actions. The Israeli leader also met with Vice President Kamala Harris Thursday. On Friday, he is expected to head to Florida for a Mar-a-Lago visit with former President Donald Trump. CBS News correspondent Skylar Henry is at the White House. Skylar, what is the White House saying about the status of negotiations for a ceasefire deal in Gaza?
Yeah, John, well, if you let the White House tell it, they will say that the two sides appear to be close as it relates to at least some progress towards a ceasefire deal, at least for those first 6 weeks. And then, of course, that hostage release plan as well. In fact, families of those hostages were here at the White House speaking to not only the president but the prime minister about the latest with that plan. They didn't get into the specifics as far as talks and where they stand, but also expressing some optimism. And really, this is something that we've heard from the White House over the course of the last 3 weeks or so, in that they feel as if both sides appear to be inching closer and closer to finding some common ground. But John Kirby of the White House did say today that there were some gaps still there that need to be closed and filled in order for this plan to move forward. But they said that with the proper compromise and with the proper deals in place, then they felt as if something could be worked out relatively quickly. Now, what will be interesting to pay attention to is what happens after all of this. In fact, it was asked during the White House briefing, what does a post-war in Gaza look like? A lot of moving tracks, a lot of moving conversations in terms of negotiations here. And while the White House admitted that they were optimistic about where things stood in terms of the hostage release plan, they said that there's still some work to be done in other capacities as it relates to stability in the Middle East region.
As you mentioned, Skylar, they've been inching towards inching for 3 weeks. Which sort of raises questions about whether they really have been making the progress they've been talking about. The The theatrics seem cordial all the way around in this meeting. Of course, we only saw the top of it. Were you getting any indication that there's any pressure on Israel, either on the military operations taking place in Gaza or to improve the conditions of the refugees in Gaza at this point?
Well, that's interesting. I think that there are a lot of perspectives as to what exactly is going on in this current moment. And on one hand, you have the public pressure, not only from here at the White House, but from lawmakers over on Capitol Hill that were concerned about the state of civilians in Gaza, especially as it relates to getting humanitarian assistance into the region as well. In fact, it was asked during the briefing today what's going on there. The White House said that the problem isn't getting aid into Gaza, it's getting it around Gaza because of the war going on, and acknowledging that there were some missteps that were happening, accidental, according to the White House, in terms of explosives near trucks and things like that, in terms of trying to get resources to those that may need it. But it certainly appears as if, as you pointed out, cordial to say the least. Remember, John, and you know this better than I do, these two, the president and the prime minister, have had a relationship for decades now. And so we'll see, ultimately, especially considering the fact that he is in the last 6 months of his presidency, how he decides to move forward and really sort of put the pedal to the metal, if you will, in terms of trying to get something done in the Middle East, especially as it relates to getting those hostages home.
Skylar Henry at the White House. Thank you so much, Skylar. On the campaign trail Thursday morning, Vice President Kamala Harris spoke in Texas to the largest teachers union as she works to secure more labor support. Earlier, her campaign released this video you are watching right now. It's the first official 2024 presidential campaign video for Harris, set to the soundtrack of Beyoncé's song Freedom. In it, she called out her Republican opponent, Donald Trump, showing his mugshot and declaring, quote, "No one is above the law." To reporters, the vice president spoke when she arrived back in Washington, challenging the former president to a debate.
Many of you have been asking me about the debate, and I'll tell you, I'm ready to debate Donald Trump. I have agreed to the previously agreed upon September 10th debate. He agreed to that previously. Now it appears he's backpedaling, but I'm ready. And I think the voters deserve to see the split screen that exists in this race on a debate stage, and so I'm ready. Let's go.
CBS News chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes joins me now. Nancy, what do you make of that video? And beyond just the video, just the tempo of this new campaign relative to what you've been covering for the last many months?
Well, this is a campaign, John, that has really struggled over the past year with how to talk about the candidate. There's been one faction that really wanted to talk about all of his accomplishments, remind the American public what President Biden had done for them. Another faction that argued, no, we've really got to be talking about the future. Those are the kinds of campaigns that win. This campaign video that they released today was all about the future, narrated by the vice president herself, saying, what kind of future do we want when it comes to reproductive rights? What kind of future do we want when it comes to the economy? So it was really forward-looking. And so that framing, it appears for now, has won out as they try to capitalize on this energy that they're experiencing online with all the donations that are pouring in and the support that they're getting at the moment from young voters in particular.
A message about the future a lot easier to make when you're 59 than when you're when you are the president's age. Now, you spoke with the Commerce Secretary, Gina Raimondo. What did she tell you about the vice presidential speculations, which she is mixed up in?
Yes, well, she is mixed up indeed for the next couple of weeks at least, because she, as we have reported, is on the list of roughly a dozen individuals who are being vetted right now by the Harris campaign. And so we had a chance to conduct the first interview with her since being placed on that list and ask her directly whether she's being vetted and whether she can confirm that and how she feels about it. She said she's not going to get into her private conversations with the campaign, but she did say that it would be an honor to serve the vice president in that capacity and that it would be an honor for anyone. Interestingly, John, I went on to ask her, because she's one of only a couple of women who are on that list, whether she thinks the country is ready for to women at the top of a ticket, and she said absolutely. She thinks the nation is ready for whoever would do the best job as president and vice president.
So there are also some of the other people on those lists. Governor Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania, Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan, Governor of Michigan. They're going to be campaigning for Harris on Monday. Now, they would have campaigned for Biden anyway, but how do you read them being dispatched? I mean, are these tryouts? Are they just, you know, a new generation of Democrats out there, young and full of energy? How do you read those fellas on the stump?
I think we are watching tryouts in real time, John, not just out on the stump, but also on television as all of these different VP candidates are interviewed, as they are asked about Vice President Harris, as they are asked about her opponents. How do they do? Are they talented attack dogs? Are they showering her with praise? How are they framing this race? How do they handle unexpected questions? You know, all of these things that a campaign would normally take months to figure out, they've got to figure out in the next week and a half. And so events like the one that's planned now for Monday, featuring both Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro and Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer with the vice president, kind of gets you a number of things at once. You get to see both of them up on the campaign stage with her. Get a look at the body language. Are they comfortable? It also puts her in the same room with them, so she gets a little one-on-one time with the two of them as well, because chemistry and whether they can, you know, stomach being around each other every day for the next 4 years is an important consideration as well.
Right. We're all living through the hiring process at once, and the press is part of the hiring committee. Nancy Cordes, thanks a lot, Nancy.
You're welcome, John.
Former President Donald Trump did not have any events scheduled Thursday. His next rally is set for Saturday in the battleground state of Minnesota, which isn't really a battleground state, frankly. It will be his second rally alongside his running mate, Senator J.D. Vance. Meanwhile, Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg is asking a judge to reject Trump's efforts to overturn his criminal conviction. Trump's lawyers have cited the Supreme Court decision granting presidential immunity for official acts. In a Wednesday court filing, Bragg argues that the ruling does not apply to this case. The House of Representatives, by a vote of 416 to 0, voted Wednesday to establish a bipartisan task force to investigate the assassination attempt on former President Donald Trump. The task force will be comprised of 7 Republicans and 6 Democrats. Members have not yet been chosen. House Speaker Mike Johnson and Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries say the task force will have full investigative authority, including the power to issue subpoenas. The group will be required to submit a final report of its findings by December 13th. The 118th House of Representatives has been one of the least productive in history, but Thursday, the Republican majority passed a legislation to condemn the new likely Democratic nominee, condemning Vice President Harris for her, quote, failure to secure the United States border. But the vote was not entirely partisan. 6 House Democrats joined all House Republicans to pass the resolution. All of those Democratic lawmakers hail from districts in states from North Carolina to Texas to Colorado, where the vote is expected this year to be very close for those members. Only one of the Democratic lawmakers has endorsed Harris for president. The resolution is entirely symbolic. President Biden's executive order banning most undocumented immigrants from asylum has cut encounters at the southwest border in half. In the 7 weeks since the order was enacted, border encounters are down 55%. Deportations are up to more than 65,000 individuals have been returned to more than 125 countries. This, according to a new report released by the Department of Homeland Security on Thursday. CBS News immigration and politics reporter Camila Montoya Galvez joins us now from Phoenix. Camila, encounters are down. Do administration officials have any ideas about whether this trend keeps going in that direction, or do they expect a plateau at some point?
Hi, John. Yes, U.S. officials tell me that they expect the number of migrants crossing into the U.S. unlawfully along the U.S.-Mexico border to plateau in recent weeks and in the foreseeable future. Right now, as you mentioned, U.S. border agents are encountering roughly 1,700 or 1,800 migrants per day. The U.S. officials tell me that they expect that number to be between 1,000 and 2,000 for the foreseeable future. And that is because they believe that the executive action that you mentioned from President Biden that disqualifies most migrants from asylum has had most of its impact already. They don't believe that the executive order will lead to another dramatic drop. But again, make no mistake, John, this is still a dramatic change and a seismic shift from just a few months ago. Back in December, during a record-breaking surge at the border, Border Patrol was encountering an average of 8,000 migrants per day. Now it is about 1,700 or 1,800, as we just mentioned, and the numbers are very low compared to other months, including March, April, May, and June. And so we should expect another drop in monthly encounters in July, and we should expect the level of illegal immigration at the border, John, to actually be lower in July than in the fall of 2020 during the Trump administration, which is something, by the way, John, that President Biden mentioned in his speech last night.
And so when the president mentioned that, that was correct, at least for those two comparative time periods.
That's right.
And let me ask you this, Camilo. There were concerns. Well, let me put it this way. How has this gone logistically? I mean, that, as you mentioned, the numbers are quite significant. And just in terms of deporting to 125 different countries, how has it gone ramping up to this new program so quickly?
That's such a critical question because, as we have discussed previously, John, the migration flows at the border have not only increased in volume, but also in the number of countries where these people are coming from. Before, most migrants were coming from Mexico, Central America, and maybe a few other countries in Latin America. But now they're coming from across the world in South America, Central America, the Caribbean, Africa, Asia, and other parts of the globe. And it is much harder for the U.S., as you know, John, to deport people to Africa and Asia and some parts of Latin America, for that matter, than it is to deport them to Central America and Mexico, where the U.S. carries out regular deportations. So to answer your question, the executive order is mainly affecting Mexicans and migrants from Central America and other countries where the U.S. conducts regular deportations. The other migrants are still banned from asylum, but some of them are still being released into the U.S. because we don't have deportation agreements with those countries, or the cadence of the flights, the deportation flights to those countries, is much more smaller in scope. But the administration is taking another step to try to reduce migration from these so-called extracontinental migrants. And one of those steps, John, is to ask countries like Ecuador and Mexico to impose visa requirements on migrants who are using their countries as effectively lily pads to then get to the U.S. border. And we have already seen Ecuador, for example, impose visa requirements on Chinese migrants. And the administration expects to see a decrease in Chinese migration to the U.S.-Mexico border after that action, John.
That's really interesting. Camila Montoya Galvez in Arizona. Thank you so much, Camila. Wildfires are spreading across the western United States and Canada. Over 170 fires were burning in the Canadian western province of Alberta on Thursday. Thousands of residents have been under evacuation orders in the region since last week. Here in the United States, nearly 90 wildfires are burning, covering over 1.6 million acres. More than 40 of those fires are burning in the states of Oregon and Washington. The Durkee Fire in Oregon is the largest in the country, having burned more than 268,000 acres. That's nearly double the size of the city of Chicago. Meanwhile, the Park Fire in Northern California has burned over 71,000 acres. Jonathan Vigliotti joins me now from Chico, California. Jonathan, what's the latest with the fire?
Yeah, John, good evening to you. Tonight, more than a dozen homes look like this one, charred down to their foundations as the flames quickly swept in. This evening, we're told more than 1,100 firefighters are now here battling this blaze, and they have their work cut out for them. We're told that the flames have now progressed into remote, rugged terrain. That firefight complicated by triple-digit heat, high wind, and all of that bone-dry vegetation. It is incredible to think just 24 hours ago, this fire was just a brush fire that overnight then exploded into a 70,000-acre monster. Hard to put out then, difficult to put out now as fire crews are working overhead and on the ground. Thousands of people still under that mandatory evacuation that was set into place yesterday. And we're learning this evening there is now an investigation into a 42-year-old Chico man who was taken into custody for possible arson. Fire crews were alerted to him by several eyewitnesses. We actually spoke with one of those eyewitnesses who described his actions more as negligence, saying he was driving his car erratically, drove into a ditch, and then spun his tires to try to get out. The friction from doing so, creating sparks, marking that fire, making that master blaze that we're now dealing with today. The investigation continues, and that firefight continues as well. The high winds continue to be an issue this evening, John.
Jonathan Bigliotti in Chico, California. Thank you very much, Jonathan. We want to take you live to the White House, where Vice President Kamala Harris is speaking to reporters after meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
How it does so matters. Hamas is a brutal terrorist organization. On October 7, Hamas triggered this war when it massacred 1,200 innocent people, including 44 Americans. Hamas has committed horrific acts of sexual violence and took 250 hostages. There are American citizens who remain captive in Gaza. Sagi Deko Hen, Hirsch Goldberg, Poland, Idan Alexander, Keith Siegel, Omer Nutra, and the remains of American citizens Judy Weinstein, Gad Haggai, and Itai Hen are still being held in Gaza. I have met with the families of these American hostages multiple times now, and I've told them each time they are not alone, and I stand with them. And President Biden and I are working every day to bring them home. I also expressed with the Prime Minister my serious concern about the scale of human suffering in Gaza, including the death of far too many innocent civilians. And I made clear my serious concern about the dire humanitarian situation there, with over 2 million people facing high levels of food insecurity, and 500,000 people facing catastrophic levels of acute food insecurity. What has happened in Gaza over the past 9 months is devastating. The images of dead children and desperate, hungry people fleeing for safety, sometimes displaced for the second, third, or fourth time. We cannot look away in the face of these tragedies. We cannot allow ourselves to become numb to the suffering, and I will not be silent. Thanks to the leadership of our President, Joe Biden, there is a deal on the table for a ceasefire and a hostage deal. And it is important that we recall what the deal involves. The first phase of the deal would bring about a full ceasefire, including a withdrawal of the Israeli military from population centers in Gaza. In the second phase, the Israeli military would withdraw from Gaza entirely, and it would lead to a permanent end to the hostilities. It is time for this war to end, and end in a way where Israel is secure, all the hostages are released, the suffering of Palestinians in Gaza ends, and the Palestinian people can exercise their right to freedom, dignity, and self-determination. There has been hopeful movement in the talks to secure an agreement on this deal. And as I just told Prime Minister Netanyahu, it is time to get this deal done. So to everyone who has been calling for a ceasefire, and to everyone who yearns for peace, I see you and I hear you. Let's get the deal done so we can get a ceasefire to end the war. Let's bring the hostages home, and let's provide much-needed relief to the Palestinian people. And ultimately, I remain committed to a path forward that can lead to a two-state solution. And I know right now it is hard to conceive of that prospect, but a two-state solution is the only path that ensures Israel remains a secure Jewish and democratic state, and one that ensures Palestinians can finally realize the freedom, security, and prosperity that they rightly deserve. And I will close with this then. It is important for the American people to remember the war in Gaza is not a binary issue. However, too often the conversation is binary, when the reality is anything but. So I ask my fellow Americans to help encourage efforts to acknowledge the complexity, the nuance, and the history of the region. Let us all condemn terrorism and violence. Let us all do what we can to prevent the suffering of innocent civilians, and let us condemn anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and hate of any kind. And let us work to unite our country. I thank you.
Madam Vice President, after your meeting, are you...
Vice President Kamala Harris not taking questions from reporters. She was speaking after meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The vice president, you heard there at the end, speaking about the complexity of the issue, that saying it is not a binary issue and that Americans need to acknowledge the complexity. She tried to do that in her remarks as well, calling out Hamas for its horrific attack on the 7th of October, but also saying to those who are concerned about the bloodshed, violence, and refugees in Gaza, I see you and I hear you. Also, the vice president there speaking in concert with the president's policy of supporting a two-state solution after the peace deal, should one come about at the end of this conflict, after a multi-stage ceasefire deal that the president has put forward. If that were to come to be, she supports a two-state solution. That is not something that the Prime Minister of Israel has supported, Benjamin Netanyahu. And this, of course, all in the new reality of American politics, where the vice president is not just speaking now as a member of the administration, but as the likely Democratic nominee. We're going to take a short break now. You are streaming The Daily Report.
Coming up, our series. Wait a minute. Tom, is that you working the camera?
Keep leaning out of your close-up.
Your morning routine just got better. CBS Mornings, weekdays at 7.
I had progressively fallen deeper into the world of online sports betting.
The risk is the rush.
What do you think is driving the spike in popularity?
I think it's legality.
If it's legal, I'm going to use it. There are ways to bet when you are 18.
We've created an epidemic of child gambling.
You can't walk into a male dormitory in a college campus without sports betting happening.
It's America's most neglected problem.
I used sports betting as a way to escape, when in reality, I'm choosing self-destruction. Whatever I had left, it was gone.
The purpose of the industry is to get you to play to extinction. And that means until all your money is gone.
Go to the ends of the earth. Reach for the stars.
Yeah, I just took off. That kind of thing.
Oh, that's pretty good. Because there's always something new under the sun on CBS Sunday morning.
An original documentary from CBS Reports.
That desired farm is a wonderful place to raise children, and it still is.
Promises broken.
Black Americans have been the target of racism and discrimination pretty much from the time they acquired ownership in the land.
Costing black farmers hundreds of billions in generational wealth.
They did everything to make sure we were run off that land.
But communities are uniting to continue the fight.
Collective ownership is powerful.
To keep their land and their dreams alive.
To watch my children play on land that we own means everything.
So land is power.
Most definitely.
40 Acres and a Mule, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
People with developmental disabilities were once sequestered by the hundreds of thousands in institutions.
Many of our fellow citizens are suffering tremendously because lack of attention, lack of imagination, lack of adequate manpower.
Disability activists have since torn down barriers blocking them from living at home or in the community.
We conclude that Title II of the ADA requires states to provide community-based treatment for persons with mental disabilities.
But of the 16,000 people who remain in state-operated institutions, half are in 5 states, and Illinois is one of them.
I don't want to live in the institution. It makes me feel discriminated against.
Do you think there are people living in institutions in Illinois that don't need to be living there?
Yeah, because they're proving it as soon as they get out.
Welcome back to the Daily Report. I'm John Dickerson. Here are some additions to our top stories. Missouri's Supreme Court blocked the release of a man who was set to be free after his murder conviction was overturned. Christopher Dunn was found guilty in a 1990 killing, but a judge last month said there was evidence of his innocence, but the Republican Attorney General has been fighting the release. California Governor Gavin Newsom has ordered the removal of homeless encampments across the state. The move comes a month after the Supreme Court ruled that cities could ban people from sleeping outside in public spaces. 30% of all homeless people in the country are in California. NASA says there's no return date yet for the 2 astronauts sent to the International Space Station on Boeing's Starliner. Sonny Williams and Butch Wilmore were only supposed to be in space for 8 days, but problems with the capsule have kept them there for 7 weeks and counting. The Democratic National Committee says it will hold a virtual roll call by August 7th to select its nominees for president and vice president. The process could make it difficult for anyone to challenge the current vice president and presumptive Democratic nominee, Kamala Harris. CBS News has also confirmed the Harris campaign is considering about a dozen potential running mates. So to talk about this, Major Garrett joins me now from Nashville, Tennessee. Major, I know you interviewed RFK Jr., and I want to get to that soundbite, so I'm just going to ask you one question about this Harris business. Can you tell me if you think the map or the electorate changes with her as the nominee? Are there different parts of the electorate that we should be focusing on now? And if Biden was running in the Midwest as his blue wall, is that still true for Harris, or does she have opportunities in Georgia, Arizona, Nevada?
Oh, she certainly has opportunities in Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada. And what has changed structurally in this race, John, is before President Biden made the announcement that he would not seek renomination and a second term, is that all that was really left credibly for the Democratic National Committee, the Biden-Harris reelection campaign, was holding on to Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, and even that was going to be difficult. They didn't concede Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada, but the numbers there were trending very negatively against the Biden reelection campaign. Now that President Biden has decided to step away from this race and being replaced, if that is in fact what the Democratic National Committee does, with the presumptive nominee who has all the delegate momentum behind her, Vice President Kamala Harris, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada are now all equally competitive. So the map as we understood it in 2020 is the map of 2024, with one possible addition, North Carolina. Former President Trump carried it in 2016, but he carried it by half as much in terms of percentage vote in 2020. Democrats have long said North Carolina might be a potential takeaway state on the 2024 map. Kamala Harris does nothing to discourage those plans. So the map that was most aspirational for Democrats heading into 2024, but wasn't with President Biden leading the ticket, again, is now.
Excellent tour there. And we should note North Carolina won once by Obama, then lost by Obama, and then lost by Hillary, just to give everybody what they need to know on North Carolina. Now, you're in Nashville. You interviewed RFK Jr., and let's listen to a clip from that interview.
Did you watch the president's address last night?
I watched part of it.
Your impression?
I think it was more of a statement about what his accomplishments were rather than sort of a reassurance to the American public about where we are today.
Did he provide an adequate explanation of the circumstances of the last week, to your belief?
I don't think so.
What's missing?
Well, you know, I've known Joe Biden for 40 years, and I commend him and respect him for the 50 years that he gave in service to our country. But I think he tarred that reputation and that career over the past year by refusing to let go of power. And, you know, one of the things that a lot of Americans blame Donald Trump for is the January 6th event, which suggested that he was unwilling to let go of power. And let me just finish what I'm saying. You know, one of the most important events in the history of our country was George Washington's decision to resign after the second term. So I think part of our traditions is that our leaders relinquish power, and that they do that graciously. And no, I don't think that President Trump did that graciously, and I don't think President Biden did either.
John, what's interesting about that exchange, John, is that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. kind of drew, and when you see the interview in full, you'll see me pressing on this. Are you drawing a moral equivalence between what happened on January 6th and how former President Trump, then President Trump, certainly egged all of that on with a reluctancy on President Biden to step away from power and step away from re-election, step away from the campaign in 2024? And he didn't really land solidly on a definitive answer there. The one thing I was able to find out from Robert F. Kennedy Jr. in our extended conversation is that he doesn't believe that January 6th rioters who stormed the Capitol were activists, and he believes those prosecuted for serious felonies are not political prisoners. So we got some clarity on that. But on this, whether or not this graciousness and relinquishing power is morally equivalent between Biden and former President Trump, still murky.
Yes, a fascinating exchange, Major. Thank you so much. Major Garrett in Nashville, Tennessee. Diplomatic sources tell CBS News that Israel has submitted new demands in the negotiations for a ceasefire. The demands from Prime Minister Netanyahu include Israeli forces remaining in the Philadelphia corridor. That's an 8-mile strip of land between the Gaza Strip and Egypt. The nation is also refusing to allow unrestricted access for Palestinians seeking to return to their homes in northern Gaza. As we've been reporting, the new demands come as Netanyahu delivered a fiery address to Congress Wednesday and met with President Biden Thursday. Sources say he also postponed Israeli negotiators' trip to Qatar, which was scheduled for this week to continue those negotiations over a ceasefire. CBS News intelligence and national security reporter Olivia Gazis joins me now. Olivia, how are negotiators expected to react to these new demands from Israel? Could they slow the talks? And can you characterize these talks? We keep hearing they're getting closer and closer and closer, but they've been doing that for 3 weeks.
If not months, John, you're
Right.
absolutely right. I mean, arguably, these new conditions have already slowed the talks, right? They were supposed to be in person in the region happening today, and instead now they're supposed to resume next week at the Israeli government's insistence. And you've already seen reaction from some of the negotiating parties, namely U.S. officials who have said the time to close this deal is now. You just heard the vice president say that right now. And yesterday, a U.S. official saying that this deal is in its closing stages and is closable, subject to what this official called implementation issues, and that's a reference to the conditions that Israel has now put on the table, sensing it had a strengthened hand in this negotiation, that, yes, maintaining security of the Philadelphia corridor and setting new parameters for how Gazans can eventually return to the north.
Why insist on this presence in the corridor, in that Philadelphia corridor along Gaza?
Right. So this is that 100-yard wide stretch of land that you referenced between Egypt and Gaza that had been controlled by the Egyptians, but Israeli forces took it over in May, arguing that Hamas had dug tunnels underneath it, some of them wide enough to let vehicles through, and had been funneling personnel and weapons through the tunnels underneath there. And the argument goes that you cannot ensure that Hamas will not rearm and rebuild if you don't maintain security of those tunnels. Egypt's counter-argument, of course, is this is an essential corridor for facilitating trade with the Palestinian people. From what I've been talking to with Israeli and U.S. officials, it seems like this may be the easier nut to crack. There are a number of solutions being bandied about, one of them potentially installing a surveillance system within the tunnels that do still remain. But again, this is one of the things that negotiators are going to tackle now next week.
In a totally different topic, but a really fascinating development, the U.S. has intercepted Russian and Chinese warplanes flying near Alaska in what appears to be their first joint mission. What do you know about that?
Sure. Well, it's not great, as they say, John. It's certainly not a good development for the United States, which has been concerned about this rapprochement between the Chinese and the Russians. U.S. officials tried to play it down today. The Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin saying it was not a surprise, and the closest that these bombers ever came was about 200 miles off of the coast of Alaska. But it's still precedent-setting, and it's in the context of this continued support that China has been providing Russia, especially as it prosecutes its war in Ukraine. We know that this months-long diplomatic pressure campaign by the West on China to stop that hasn't been very effective. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is expected to meet his counterpart, and I'm sure this will come up this week.
Olivia Gazis, thank you so much, Olivia.
Thank you.
The United States is imposing sanctions more than ever. But what are the downsides of America's economic warfare around the globe, and do these sanctions really do what they're supposed to? We will discuss that. You're streaming The Daily Report.
Washington is the seat of power. National security, foreign policy, global economics, every story comes through Washington in some way. We bring some of the most powerful voices in America to the table. We don't just ask the questions, you have to go deeper. We try to understand what's at the heart of the issue we're talking about, to then come forward with solutions.
Face the Nation on CBS.
The justices ruled that Harvard and the University of North Carolina violated the Constitution.
In the aftermath of the Supreme Court decision to end affirmative action in college admissions, uncertainty sets in for some students of color.
Affirmative action really gave us an equal opportunity.
CBS Reports explores the historic decision and what it means for those chasing an opportunity to change their lives.
I knew that college was the ticket to break this cycle.
The end of affirmative action, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
America Decides is your place for fact-based, unbiased reporting.
At the White House, at the Capitol, on the campaign trail.
What do you say to those in your party?
Any cracks in the Republican Party?
Our reporters and our anchors travel the country talking to voters like you
about the issues that matter most.
Immigration is really a factor right now
that are going to be driving your decisions.
What would you say to those who say, look, that's just democracy at work?
Listening to you and bringing your voice into our coverage.
I want a strong, proud America.
Is democracy on the ballot in 2024?
Let us help you decide.
America Decides on CBS News 24/7.
Stream our expanded one-hour program Monday through Thursday at 5 p.m. Eastern.
An original documentary from CBS Reports.
AI is among the most world-changing technologies ever.
Curing diseases, scientific breakthroughs, making lives better.
It can help us with medical discoveries, scientific discoveries, doing better agriculture, having cures for things like Alzheimer's.
It's also going to really transform the way we work.
The uplifting potential of artificial intelligence is limitless.
It gives you a friend, somebody to chat with 24/7. That is non-judgmental. He makes me feel loved and desired.
And so are its downfalls.
The problem with all this AI is that it's unpredictable and uncontrollable. The choices we make now will have lasting effects for decades, maybe even centuries.
The ChatGPT revolution, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
We are about to see American weapons in the hands of Mexican cartels.
A gun pipeline to Mexico.
We are arming the cartels.
100%, no doubt about it.
Happening right under our noses.
Who's doing something about this? Nobody.
A CBS Reports exclusive.
Most Americans have no idea that we are effectively arming the enemy next door.
This is the story the American people need to know.
Arming cartels, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
The United States economy accelerated in the second quarter. The Commerce Department says the nation's gross domestic product, or GDP, rose at an annual rate of 2.8% from April through June. That's more than the 1.9% rate economists had expected for the second quarter. Experts say the growth is due to an increase in consumer spending and business investing more in their inventories, despite the pressure of continually high interest rates. Jeff Stein joins me for more. He's a White House economics reporter for the Washington Post. Jeff, I'm going to run you through a couple of different questions here. You wrote a big takeout on economic warfare, which we're going to get to in a moment, but I want to first get your take on what this GDP growth tells us about the state of the economy and how you think the Fed will read that data.
This is one of the best days that people who work in the economic policy shop at the White House have had in a while. There was fears after the last GDP report that we could be heading for a slowdown induced by the interest rates that you referenced. But this is really a Goldilocks report in that it's not like we're seeing a pickup in GDP growth that's consistent with a reacceleration of inflation. The biggest source of the GDP growth that we saw was the increase in business inventories. And that is something that is not really responsive to interest rates the same way that consumer spending might be. And so people in the White House, Democrats, are quite optimistic that this report, while while still showing some heat in the economy, suggests that maybe the Fed could still cut, that there won't be an impetus to stop the attempt to cut because of this report, because of this acceleration.
Now I'm going to take you to another story you wrote about recently on the topic of the economy. You wrote about Vice President, now likely Democratic nominee Kamala Harris's discussions about what is referred to as the care economy agenda. Explain what that is and what it seeks to achieve.
Yeah, we're in this weird period right now that I'm sure you've noticed where everyone is kind of seeing what they want to in the vice president. They're kind of projecting their hopes and seeing reflected back what they hope she'll be. And that's obviously a great place to be as a presidential candidate. But as the campaign goes on, she has to make some commitments. And one of the ones that she's actually been quite clear on is the set of expansions to the social safety net that Democrats tried under Biden that they weren't able to get through. Harris has signaled very clearly that she's interested in picking these up. And these poll really well, and they also address what a lot of people think are pretty severe crises for the bottom of the income distribution, but also for the middle class, a lack of paid family leave, a lack of childcare, a lack of elder care, issues with health care, sort of bread and butter economic issues for Democrats that Biden had made gestures toward, wasn't able to complete, but Harris has really, in her ability to sort of effectively deliver clear, cogent talking points, has really made clear that these are things that she wants to do. And we're still trying to figure out, what are her priorities exactly. And I think she's been quite deft at letting, as I said, sort of the unions think that she's on their side, letting the big businesses think that she's on their side more than Biden. Both of those can't be true, but found some smart middle grounds to stake out that both sides would be happy to see.
Now, I want to get to your big takeout, history of economic sanctions. You suggest they may not be successful or effective in many cases.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we have seen an astonishing increase in the level of economic warfare, and I'm really grateful that you're having me on to talk about it because under the Bush administration, right, under George W. Bush, we saw two truly disastrous wars that most Americans, polling suggests, were quite appalled by. There were huge numbers of casualties, including American troops, a loss of trillions of dollars of U.S. taxpayer money. And so there's been a response in the 15, 20 years since to say, we don't want to see American troops put in harm's way as much. And so the response from U.S. presidents has been, how do we continue to exert the U.S. role on the world stage? How do we continue to assert U.S. foreign policy dominance and act in our interest? And to put it less cynically, to try to improve outcomes in places where maybe dictators are doing terrible things, or maybe regimes are suspending elections or torturing dissidents or whatever. How do we still respond to that without going to war? And so in that breach, we've seen a huge rise in these economic sanctions, these measures that restrict economic activities with these countries, which now we reported today are in effect in some form, not just on the whole country, but also often on individuals or companies, but on 33% of the entire world, and 60% of all poor countries are under some form of U.S. sanctions. It's a staggering increase from 20 years ago when it was really just Cuba and a couple other countries.
So in the last 30 seconds we have left, they may not be effective. And then also, do they have downsides? I mean, as you write, pushing countries into the arms of other countries with these sanctions.
Yeah, we're seeing China and Iran and Russia really step up their attempts to work together, because the premise of sanctions really depends on dependence on the U.S. dollar. So if these countries decide that they don't need to access the Western financial system for complicated reasons people should read about in my story, if that's the case, then they can build their alternate sort of outside of that U.S. system financial ties. And we're seeing the U.S. adversaries do that, which risks making this tool less and less effective over time. So it's a fascinating issue, and it really has had tremendous consequences for tens of millions of people all over the world: Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, Nicaragua. I could spend the rest of the segment listing countries that have been affected by this.
Well, it's really important reporting, and people should read it, because every day I feel like I'm announcing some new sanctions that are being imposed in one way or another, and this puts it in great context. Jeff Stein with the Washington Post. Thank you so much, Jeff.
Pleasure. Thank you so much, John.
The opening ceremony for the Paris Olympics, those ceremonies are less than 24 hours away. We'll hear the latest from the City of Lights on the Olympics and the heightened security measures the city is taking to protect the athletes and the Olympic attendees. You're streaming the Daily Report.
Go to the ends of the earth.
Right now.
We got something crazy. And reach for the stars.
Here we are. Time.
Yes, it's my comeback.
Hey, this is pretty fun.
But wait, there's more.
Experience thought-provoking,
I'm open to the idea of being a human being.
innovative, and truly original reporting.
Look through a telescope and go, wow.
Because there's always something new under the sun on CBS Sunday morning.
At this moment, terrorists could be plotting another attack.
9/11 triggered a counter-terrorist system that included a secret database.
This person needs a closer look.
A growing list of nearly 2 million people, including some Americans who say they're innocent.
For 1 hour flight, I have to spend 6 hours to go and come back.
CBS Reports explores the system, the people responsible for it, and those pushing for change.
I'm not fighting against them. I'm fighting for them to do the right thing.
The Watch List, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
Don't miss true crime anytime you want, anywhere you go. With the 48 Hours podcast. Real crimes, real lives, real justice.
There's some questions that have to be asked and need to be answered.
Listen to 48 Hours on Apple Podcasts.
An original documentary from CBS Reports.
Imagine yourself in Manhattan with no police, no army, no mayor.
The people of Haiti stare down poverty, corruption, natural disasters, and violence.
90% of the guns that are used by gangs in Haiti are American guns.
But with an unbreakable spirit and eternal optimism.
There are days where I cry, but we can't be discouraged. We still believe in Haiti.
They're still able to look ahead with hope.
Haiti is on the brink of transformation, a radical shift. Haitians are coming together and saying things must change.
Fighting for Haiti, now streaming on the free CBS News app.
Hey there, welcome to The Uplift.
I thought she was a groom, and I stepped back and I went, oh, you're the queen. She's going to be with me every instant that I'm alive.
I just wanted to see if you'd go to Disneyland with me today.
I look over at him and he's smiling.
I'm going to remember that the rest of my life.
They told us when he was going to be born, he was only going to live for 30 minutes. It's really a miracle that he's with us today.
The Uplift. Stream now on the free CBS News app.
When you wake up in the morning, we want to be your go-to team.
On our places, bright, shiny faces.
I don't go to work in the morning. I go for coffee with my two good friends, and we talk about the world.
Your morning routine just got better. CBS Mornings.
A CBS News investigation. People looking for love, finding their life savings gone.
This could happen to anybody.
And sometimes losing their lives. Anything for love. Now streaming on the free CBS News app.
Thousands of athletes from around the world will be present for a unique opening ceremony to the Olympics Friday. Usually the event kicks off inside a stadium, but for Paris, athletes representing 206 countries will sail 4 miles down the Seine River. At the end of the route, the Olympic torch will be lit, marking the commencement of the 2024 Games. CBS News sports correspondent and anchor Dana Jacobson joins us now from Paris. Dana is also the co-host of CBS Saturday Morning, which you all know. So, Dana, what do we need to know about Friday's opening ceremony?
Well, you said, I think, the highlight there. I mean, they're taking boats down the Seine. You think about any other Olympics you've seen, every other time it's been in a stadium. And instead, Paris, 100 years after hosting its last Olympics, does it only the way Paris can. The Seine is the artery here in the city. There'll be about 90 boats that carry this parade of nations. The flag bearers on those boats, you may also have heard, we're having male and female. It's the first Olympics that actually has an even split of men and women when it comes to athletes. For the U.S. delegation, it's the penultimate boat. That's because Paris, as the host nation, will be last. The U.S. will be hosting the next Summer Games. That's in Los Angeles. So they get that designation just before Paris. We've got LeBron James for the men, Coco Gauff for the women. And she actually talked about being a flag bearer today to the media. She said she didn't know what to expect. She watched some other games. She was trying to get an idea. She thought maybe they'd each have their own flag. And then she thought about the size difference when she heard they'd have to share the flag because LeBron is, well over 6 feet. I think he's around 6'9", if I remember. Coco Gauff shorter. They'll figure it out, she said, when they get on the boat. And you mentioned they're going to take this down to about the Eiffel Tower where they'll have the lighting of the Olympic flame. But also there'll be performances in between. And the big news today that we are hearing, several sources are telling reporters around the area that we will see Celine Dion and Lady Gaga performing in a duet during that opening ceremony. La Vie en Rose, so appropriate, both women with ties here to France. I think that's sort of the highlight for many people, but also a highlight will be the spectators along the banks, 300,000 of them to take it all in.
Wow. All right, now, something that big and public and full of complexity obviously leads to the question, what security measures is Paris taking for this extraordinary opening ceremony?
Yeah, very tight. They've got about 45,000 police and military on hand for the opening ceremony, and each day it'll range between 30 to 45,000 when it comes to law enforcement. 1,800 police from 80 different countries from around the world are actually participating in this. And that opening ceremony, because it's behind me, you can't really see, but it's a short walk there to the River Seine. It's all on lockdown, has been for about a week. We were there early. It was eerily very quiet, trying to keep the security as tight as possible. It's a big challenge, as you mentioned. We talked to Mark Hecker, who's a security expert for a think tank here in Paris earlier in the week. And he said at an event like this, there is always risk. The idea for security is just trying to mitigate that risk.
Well, Dana Jacobson, I hope
security measures are just amazing. I told you, all the number of policemen, gendarmes, soldiers, and so on. Plus, they are also testing new technologies. For instance, new CCTV with algorithms. They also use new methods to try and counter drones. So I think it's quite hard to get a higher level of security measures. At some point, you have to accept the risk.
And he said it's also the resilience of the people that will show up. He said the one threat that is the most concerning would be a lone actor attack, and that's because of the nature of it. One person in a crowd with, let's say, a knife or a car. But again, the idea is just try to mitigate that risk and keep these games safe.
Dana Jacobson in Paris. Can't wait to talk to you again, Dana. Thanks. Here's a look at some of the stories we're covering in our next hour. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu meets with President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris amid pressure in his country to secure a ceasefire deal to bring hostages home. Plus, we have new numbers from the Homeland Security Department on encounters at the southern border. We'll break down the data and how they reflect White House policies. And we'll take a deep dive on American sanctions on international adversaries and questions about whether they're working or not. You're streaming the Daily Report.
Okay, so let's just start at the beginning.
Well, let me start with this. What is at stake here?
What is the answer then?
Do you know why?
You want me to just keep going?
Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Were there death threats?
How is this possible?
What's wrong with that argument?
Are you saying they lied?
Have you told the government that? Why won't you say the word crisis?
You're not answering my question.
Is that scary?
Does that make sense?
What do you mean? What does that mean in
Did any of that make sense?
What's your response?
What happened?
Why?
It's time for the CBS News Original 60 Minutes, Sunday on CBS and streaming on Paramount+.
There is no more room in our city.
New York City is receiving record numbers of migrants.
Today, we're going to have more than 500 adults and children come through that door.
Tensions rise as shelters reach max capacity.
We don't have to take care of them.
CBS Reports goes inside a crisis cities and families are facing as they fight to survive.
The United States still has that glimmer of hope for people to come here.
Fighting for a future. Now streaming on the free CBS News app. An original documentary from CBS Reports.
Since you started La Soup in 2014, do you have any sense as to how much food you've rescued from the landfill?
We've rescued 4.5 million pounds.
I can't even